Hello everyone, welcome to Brainstorm Lore and welcome back to the Targaryen conquest of Westeros. When we last left off, Aegon Targaryen had just declared war in his intention of uniting every bit of Westeros south of the Wall. Now his task was to prove that he was in fact capable of doing just that. You might forgive those who weren't exactly impressed with Aegon when he first made this announcement. When he left Dragonstone and landed at the mouth of the river known as the Blackwater Rush, he had only 4 lords and their small armies to his name, in addition to his own house troops. 2 were of Valyrian ancestry, the confusingly named Valerians of Driftmark and the Celtigars of Claw Isle. The other 2, Lord Emmon of Sharp Point and Lord Massey of Stone Dance, were technically sworn to Argilac the Arrogant, but had chosen to throw their lot in with Aegon due to closer relations to Dragonstone. Doubtless this was the result of their proximity to the selfsame island. Sources differ on the exact size of the initial Targaryen force, but the numbers don't seem to be much higher than 3,000. Not the most impressive host, even with 3 dragons. And while Vhagar, Meraxes, and Balerion would prove to be Aegon's most valuable battlefield asset, he knew that all the literal firepower in the world wouldn't mean much if he couldn't secure his position, and quickly. Immediately after making landfall, Aegon and most of his followers immediately set to work building a wooden palisade to protect their small army. Meanwhile, he ordered Visenya and Rhaenys to take their 2 dragons and secure the allegiance of as many nearby castles as they could. Even factoring in the dragons, Aegon's most precious resource at this point was time, and he didn't have much to spare. Still, as I've said repeatedly, Aegon was a clever man, and had taken what steps he could to ensure that he had as much time as he could get. By choosing an initial landing site on the border between Harren the Black and Argilac the Arrogant's domain, neither king was able to immediately decide who should deal with him. And so, while the 2 kings dithered, the Aegon fort, as it came to be known, was completed, and Rhaenys and Visenya managed to intimidate several of the local lords into siding with their brother husband. We are told that at least a dozen houses bent the knee to Aegon and his sisters, though only 2 are actually described. These being the neighboring holdings of Rosby and Stokeworth, the former of which surrendered immediately at the mere sight of Meraxes, and the latter which held out a little while until Vhagar started setting some roofs on fire. We're never given any dates as to this early part of the conquest, so we don't know how long this actually took. All we do know is that while Visenya and Rhaenys were away, recruiting, Aegon and his followers faced their first real challenge. Kings Harren and Argilac may have been slow to act, but the same could not be said of Lord Darkland of Duskendale and Lord Mooten of Maidenpool, the 2 largest settlements in the immediate vicinity of the Aegon fort. Both of them were rich port towns, Duskendale situated on Blackwater Bay and Maidenpool the Bay of Crabs. As such, both families, especially the Darklands, had gained some pretty impressive coffers due to the local trade. And in the medieval world, lots of coin means lots of soldiers. As soon as word reached them of Aegon's landing, the 2 lords formed an alliance and immediately marshaled their armies to go and confront him. Our sources say that the 2 lords had a combined force of 3,000 men, putting them roughly equivalent to the maximum estimated number of Aegon's initial invasion force, and it's more than likely that in reality the 2 lords had Aegon outnumbered. That said, while Aegon's sisters may have been away, he still had a dragon of his own, and as long as he had Balerion the Black Dread at his side, I think we can safely assume that Aegon was not overly concerned. The battle itself was a very short and simple affair. Orys Baratheon led the troops from the ground to engage the 2 lords, and while the 2 sides were locked together in combat, Aegon simply swooped down and started roasting some men in their own armor. Both lords were killed, and their immediate successors, Lord Darkland's son and Lord Mooten's brother, swiftly bent the knee to spare themselves and their holdings. Neither town was sacked, but it is described that Duskendale was forced to pay out considerable tribute to the Targaryens to support their growing army. It is not mentioned if they did the same to Maidenpool, but given that that was also a very rich town, I find it hard to believe that the Targaryens would not have passed up the opportunity to squeeze them as well. So far so good. Aegon had established a beachhead for himself, gotten most of his new neighbors to swear loyalty to him, and he even now had a quick victory under his belt. Apparently, he decided that now was the time for a bit of pomp and circumstance. All of the local lords that had bent the knee to Aegon were summoned to a low-budget coronation ceremony at the Aegon fort. The lords all handed over their swords to Aegon and then knelt. Visenya placed a crown of Valyrian steel studded with rubies upon her brother-husband's brow, while Rhaenys proclaimed him Aegon, first of his name, king of all Westeros and shield of his people. The newly crowned king then bid each of his new vassals to rise, confirming each man in his lands and titles. This last part seems an empty formality, but in fact this was an actual tactic used by feudal rulers throughout the Middle Ages. This ceremonial confirmation was essentially Aegon's way of telling his new vassals, "You are lord of such and such, but as I am your king, your right to own that land comes from me. Just as I have the power to grant you these holdings, I also have the power to take them away." Aegon also used the ceremony to confer new titles upon his oldest and most faithful supporters. Lord Daemon Valerian of Driftmark was declared Lord of the Tides, Master of Ships and Commander of the Royal Fleet. Crispian Celtigar of Claw Isle, the first Master of Coin. Tristan Massey of Stone Dance, the first Master of Laws. As for Orys Baratheon, Aegon's half-brother and best friend, the king declared him, "My shield, my stalwart, my strong right hand." Thus Orys Baratheon became the first Hand of the King. To cap it all off, for the first time Aegon unveiled a sigil for House Targaryen. Such emblems were a popular tradition among the people of Westeros, but not something that Valyrians had ever engaged in until now. From this day forward, House Targaryen would be represented by a crimson three-headed dragon on a black field, and their name would be heralded by the now famous words, "Fire and Blood." All very nice, I'm sure, but Aegon was at heart a practical man, and knew he couldn't spend too much time on such ceremony. His quick submission of a dozen lords had the rest of Westeros up in arms. In some cases, literally. Both Harren the Black and Argilac the Arrogant were calling their banners to expel him. King Mern Gardner of the Reach was heading north to speak with King Loren Lannister of the Rock, and Torrhen Stark was said to be in constant council with his northern lords. Both Dorne and the Vale each tried to make Aegon an offer. Princess Miriam Martell made an offer of alliance against Argilac, but on the condition that Dorne be treated as an equal rather than a vassal. Queen Regent Shara Arryn made a similar offer against Harren the Black, demanding as payment the lands east of the Green Fork of the Trident. Aegon rejected both offers. With the exception of his wives, and possibly his new hand, Aegon Targaryen was a man who recognized no equals. With both the Ironborn and the Stormlanders mobilizing against him, Aegon then made a daring gambit. He opted to split his forces. On the one hand, this was a dangerous risk. Even with his new vassals, Aegon was still heavily outnumbered by any one of the 7 rulers he meant to overthrow. On the other hand, Aegon had 3 dragons, and his opponents had none. He who controls the sky controls the battlefield, as they say, and with the notable exception of Dorne, none of the 7 kingdoms could ever find a way to counter even one of Aegon's dragons, let alone all 3. It was like the military tactical equivalent of the internet meme, "I have insert here, your argument is invalid." Unfortunately, we're not given any exact numbers as to how Aegon divided his army. All that we're told is that the bulk of the army, under Orys Baratheon, would go south with Rhaenys and Meraxes to fight the Stormlanders. Visenya and Vhagar would accompany Daemon Valerian and the Targaryen fleet north to take the Vale, while Aegon and Balerion the Black Dread would lead a smaller force of troops into the Riverlands to fight the Ironborn. The first battle in this 3-pronged strategy would take place in the waters off of Gulltown, the great port city of the Vale of Arryn. Alas, once again, details on this particular battle are scanty, so this is mostly going to be me speculating based on what little confirmed data we actually have. Here's what we know for sure. Lord Admiral Daemon Targaryen commanded an unknown number of ships against an equally unknown number of vessels from Gulltown, supplemented by mercenary ships from the free city of Braavos. We know that the Vale fleet was initially victorious, destroying a third of the enemy's vessels and capturing another third, and that Lord Admiral Daemon Valerian was among the casualties. We also know that Visenya and Vhagar managed to set many of the enemy ships on fire, so that the battle resulted in a tactical draw but a strategic loss for the Targaryens, who failed to achieve a landing. Now, naval warfare in the Middle Ages was a very simplistic affair. The two sides would line up archers on their top decks and then shoot at one another until one side or the other had cleared the decks of the enemy. Then the ship would hove in closer, allowing for the medieval equivalent of Marines to board the enemy vessel and capture it. Or if destruction was your objective, you simply fired fire arrows at the enemy vessel and tried to burn it down before the enemy did the same to you. I'm going to assume that this is how the Battle of Gulltown played out before Vhagar arrived and started burning the enemy fleet. And really all the speculation on my part boils around that last point. According to both sources that mention the Battle of Gulltown, World of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood, both sources seem to imply that the Valemen had already won before Vhagar showed up, which then begs the question, why weren't Visenya and her dragon there from the very start? What made them late to the party, as it were? After pondering over the matter for some time, there are really only two plausible explanations that I can think of. The first is simple overconfidence. Lord Admiral Daemon believing that he could take the Valemen all by himself, with Visenya and Vhagar acting as a reserve should the worst happen, as in fact it did. This seems a bit unlikely though on further reflection, given that Visenya was more of a warrior and enjoyed fighting even more than Aegon or Rhaenys. I have a hard time believing that she would willingly stay out of a fight. The second, and slightly more plausible explanation, is some kind of weather. Dragons, being flying creatures, are just as subject to the whims of the weather and wind as any other. Perhaps there were strong winds from the north that day. Such strong headwinds could have slowed Vhagar down, preventing him and his rider from being with the fleet for the majority of the battle. Alternatively, perhaps such strong headwinds convinced Visenya to hold Vhagar in reserve. Perhaps she feared that forcing Vhagar to fight against such headwinds would leave him too weak to engage in the battle. In such circumstance, they would not be able to take to the air until the wind died down, and by then, of course, it was far too late. Such a strong headwind would also have worked against the Targaryen fleet as well, and help explain the seemingly one-sided nature of the initial Arryn victory. All in all, the defeat at Gulltown was a pretty severe setback for the Targaryen cause. The loss of 2/3 of their naval assets could not be brushed off so lightly, and such a defeat would certainly have rankled with the fierce and proud Visenya. Fortunately, her two younger siblings would have much better luck facing their antagonists. Next week, the Targaryen conquest continues, with the burning of Harrenhal and the Battle of the Last Storm. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.